The night I found out it wasn't raining. I always assumed a moment like that would come with weather, something cinematic, some shift in the air that would signal what was about to change. But it was a Tuesday in late October, dry and still, with a half-moon hanging over the rooftops like a tired eye. The kitchen smelled like the basil plant Nora kept on the windowsill. The dishwasher was running its quiet cycle. Everything in the house sounded the way it always sounded. And then my phone buzzed on the counter, and nothing was ever the same again. My name is Wendell. I was 38 years old that autumn. I worked in mid-level project management for a logistics company, the kind of job that sounds dull when you describe it at dinner parties, but the kind that quietly keeps things moving, keeps invoices paid, keeps trucks on the road. I wasn't flashy. I wasn't the kind of man who walked into rooms and made them different. I was steady. People used that word about me a lot, and I always took it as a compliment. Nora and I had been married for 9 years. We met at a mutual friend's birthday party when I was 28 and she was 26. She was standing near the window with a glass of red wine, laughing at something someone had said, and the laugh was so completely unguarded that I walked across the room before I even made a conscious decision to do it. We dated for 2 years before we married. We bought a house in the 4th year. We repainted it twice. We argued about tile grout and vacation dates and whether to get a dog. We had the kind of life that, from the outside, looked like exactly what it was supposed to look like. Nora worked in corporate account management. She was good at it, genuinely good, in the way that people who are naturally charismatic are good at things that require being liked. She had a quality I could never fully name. A warmth that felt completely personal, even when you suspected it was being deployed rather than felt. Colleagues adored her. Clients requested her specifically. Her boss, a quiet man named Simon, once told me at a company Christmas party that Nora was the kind of person you built a department around. I believed all of it. For years, I believed all of it without question. The message that changed everything didn't come from Nora. It came from a number I didn't recognize. No name, no context, just 12 words sitting in my notification bar like a small, quiet bomb. You should ask your wife who Camden is. I'm sorry. I stood in the kitchen for a long time after that. The dishwasher finished its cycle. The basil plant didn't move. The half-moon outside the window stayed exactly where it was. I read the message 4 times, 5 times, 6. I didn't reply. I put the phone face down on the counter and I went to bed, and I lay in the dark next to Nora, who was already asleep, her breathing slow and even, and I stared at the ceiling until sometime around 3 in the morning, when I finally understood that I wasn't going to sleep at all. I got up. I went back to the kitchen. I picked up the phone, and I started paying attention. Looking back, I can now identify the exact moment the distance began. At the time, I filed it under stress, under workload, under the ordinary friction of a long marriage settling into its later years. It was March, 7 months before that October night. Nora had been promoted to a regional account lead role, which meant more travel, more evening calls, more of those moments where she'd drift to the far end of the couch with her laptop and a posture that said don't interrupt me without her having to say anything at all. I didn't begrudge her that. She worked hard. She'd earned the promotion. I told her so. What I noticed first, and what I told myself meant nothing, was the phone. Nora had always been relaxed about her phone around me. She'd leave it on the kitchen table, screen up. She'd hand it to me to look something up when she was driving. She'd read me funny messages from her colleague Delaney, her younger sister, who had a dry humor and a habit of sending absurdly long voice notes about minor grievances. The phone was never a protected object. It was just a phone. Then, gradually, it became a protected object. It started with the screen-down habit. She began placing it face down whenever she set it on a surface. Not dramatically, not in a way that announced itself, just quietly, as a new default. I noticed it the way you notice a piece of furniture has been moved half an inch. Something was different, but you couldn't say exactly when it changed. Then the bathroom trips with the phone. Long ones. Then the new passcode. She'd always used a 4-digit code I happened to know from years of casual proximity. One evening in April, I reached over to silence her alarm while she was in the shower and the code didn't work. 6 digits now. She mentioned it later offhandedly. The app updated and forced a longer code. It was the kind of explanation that made complete sense and therefore required no follow-up. I gave it no follow-up. There were other things. Small, disconnected things that I assembled into no pattern whatsoever because I was not looking for a pattern. Nora began going to the gym on Friday evenings, which was new. She'd always preferred morning workouts. She bought 2 new dresses in the space of a month, which wasn't unusual except that both were for occasions she never quite described in full. She started a new skincare routine and attributed it to turning 37. She laughed more easily at her phone than she laughed at things I said, but I told myself that was the nature of group chats, of memes, of the particular humor of people who had known each other for years. I told myself a great many things. Delaney came over for dinner one Saturday in early May. Nora's younger sister was 5 years her junior. Louder, quicker to laugh, the kind of person who said exactly what she thought and occasionally regretted it. We got on well. Over dinner, the conversation turned to a charity auction Nora's company was organizing, and Delaney mentioned, casually, between bites, that she'd heard it was going to be a big event. Camden's apparently pulling out all the stops, Delaney said. There was a beat, very small, the kind of pause that doesn't register unless you're recording the evening and play it back later. He always does, Nora said, and moved the conversation to something else in under 4 seconds. I noted the name. I noted the smoothness of the redirect. I noted nothing else because at the time there was nothing else to note. A colleague's name, an event, a competent change of subject. These were the raw materials of ordinary married life, not the raw materials of catastrophe. But the name stayed in me the way a word does when you've heard it slightly wrong, hovering somewhere just below the threshold of meaning. Camden. I didn't connect it to anything for months. Not until a Tuesday in October, when 12 words arrived on my phone and the world quietly folded in half. After the message, I became a different person. Not dramatically, not in any way that Nora would have noticed. From the outside, I was the same Wendell. I went to work. I cooked dinner on the nights it was my turn. I asked about her day. I laughed at the right moments. I was, if anything, slightly more attentive, slightly more present, because I was now observing everything, cataloging everything, constructing a map of my own life from the inside. The number that had sent the message didn't respond when I eventually replied. I tried once, briefly. Who is this? The message went unread. The number appeared to be a prepaid, untraceable, the kind you could buy at a corner shop and use once. Whoever had sent it hadn't intended a conversation. They had intended a detonation and then disappeared. I went to my friend Troy first, not to confide, but to ask a practical question. Troy worked in IT and had a particular talent for understanding what information lived inside devices. Over coffee one Thursday, I asked, hypothetically, whether a person could see metadata on photos taken on someone else's phone without accessing the phone itself. Troy looked at me for a long moment, then said, not hypothetically. What's going on? I told him. Not everything, not yet, but enough. He listened without interrupting, which was unusual for Troy. Don't touch her phone, he said when I finished. Don't try to access anything directly. If this goes legal, anything you find that way gets complicated. He paused. But there are other ways. He was talking about digital shadows, metadata in shared photos, location traces in shared calendar events. Small, overlooked data points that people left behind without realizing, the way you shed skin cells without noticing. I started with the calendar. Nora and I shared a Google Calendar. We'd set it up years ago to coordinate schedules, and neither of us had ever thought much about it. I began looking at it differently. The Friday gym sessions, consistent, between 6 and 8 in the evening. But twice in October, the sessions were listed with a small location tag she hadn't removed. Not the gym. A bar called the Meridian, for miles from our house, in a neighborhood where neither of us had friends or any reason to be. I drove past the Meridian on a Saturday afternoon. It was the kind of place that was upscale without being memorable, low lighting, a long zinc bar, the sort of ambient music that made conversation easy to conceal. I sat in my car across the street for 20 minutes and felt deeply, absurdly foolish. There was nothing to see. It was 3 in the afternoon. I went home, but then Delaney called me. Not Nora, me directly on a Wednesday evening while Nora was supposedly on a work call in the study. Delaney's voice had that tight, careful quality that meant she was choosing every word. I need to ask you something, she said. And I need you to not tell Nora I called. I said I wouldn't. How are things between you two? Actually, I said fine. A reflex. The lie came before I'd even decided to tell it. A silence. Then, she's been spending time with someone from work. A lot of time. I don't know the details, Wendell. I genuinely don't. But I'm worried about her. And I don't know. I thought you should know there's something happening. I'm not saying what it is. I don't know what it is. Another pause. His name is Camden. Or Curtis, apparently he goes by both. She's mentioned him differently in different conversations, and I think she doesn't realize she's done it. After she hung up, I sat very still in the kitchen. The same chair, the same counter, the same basil plant, and something clicked into place that had been hovering just off-center for months. Camden, Curtis, two names for the same man. And a woman who had given her own sister different names for him in different conversations, as if she was testing which version of the story held together better. I didn't go to bed until 5 in the morning. When I did, I lay beside Nora and listened to her breathe and tried to understand how a person could be so present and so absent at the same time. How she could sleep like that, slow and even, next to a man she was deceiving, in a house they had built together, under a life assembled from 9 years of shared decisions. I didn't cry. I was surprised by that. I had expected to feel something wet and overwhelming. Instead, I felt precise. Cold in a way that wasn't angry, just clear. I called a lawyer the next morning. Her name was Carla Broom. She was quiet, efficient, and had a quality I would later come to deeply appreciate. She never offered an opinion I hadn't asked for. I explained the situation in broad strokes. She listened, made 3 notes, and then said, "Don't confront her yet. Don't alert her. Get documentation first and make it legal." She gave me the name of a private investigator. She said, "Whatever you find it properly." I took her advice. The private investigator was a man I'll call Mira's contact because it was actually Mira, a woman from my office who had been through a difficult divorce 2 years prior, who quietly slid his card across the desk to me one afternoon with a look that asked no questions. His name I kept private. He was methodical, almost boring in his professionalism, and in a situation where everything felt like it was shaking apart, boring professionalism was exactly what I needed. I gave him what I had: Camden, possibly also Curtis, Nora's company, the Meridian Bar, the Friday evenings, the 2-name discrepancy. He said he'd need 2 weeks. I said I had as many weeks as it took. During those 2 weeks, I noticed the way I moved through my own house differently. I had always been a man who arrived home and relaxed, who dropped his jacket and his keys and his day in the same motion, who became immediately domestic, immediately present. Now I arrived home and watched, not with hostility, with attention, the way a photographer watches, composing frames. I watched the way Nora answered her phone when I was in the same room. She turned the volume down to near 0 and angled the screen away as a reflex so practiced she no longer knew she was doing it. I watched the way she described her week. Always fluid, always detailed, always slightly too complete, as if the story had been prepared. I watched the way she touched my arm, sometimes with a warmth that felt genuine, and I thought about what it meant that warmth could be genuine and dishonest at the same time. I thought about that a lot. Meanwhile, I made a mistake. It was a small one, but it nearly unraveled everything. I mentioned Camden's name to Nora directly, not accusatorially, just casually, testing the water. I said I'd heard the name at her company event the previous year. Was he the one organizing the accounts conference? The pause was microscopic, practiced, beautiful in its precision. "Yeah," she said. "He's in business development." "Why?" "Someone at work mentioned him. I forget why." She nodded and went back to her phone. The screen was angled away before I'd finished the sentence. I hadn't learned anything I didn't know, but I had given her something. A signal, however faint, that his name had passed through my mind. I didn't know then whether she would act on it. I didn't know whether she'd tell Camden that her husband had mentioned him. I called Mira's contact that evening and told him what I'd done. He was quiet for a moment and then said, "Okay, we accelerate." 3 days later, he sent me his first report. Camden's full name was Camden Holt. He was 41. He had worked at Nora's company for 3 years in business development, which explained how their proximity had gone unquestioned. He drove a gray sedan and lived 20 minutes from our house. He was separated from his wife. That last detail landed heavily and then receded. I noted it and moved on. There were photographs. Nora and Camden at the Meridian on a Friday evening. Not sitting across from each other but beside each other, the body language of people who had long since passed the point of performing distance. There was a moment, captured mid-conversation, where her hand was on his forearm and her face had an expression I hadn't seen directed at me in longer than I could honestly remember. Not happiness exactly. Something more unguarded than happiness. I sat with that photograph for a long time. Then the investigator found something I hadn't expected, and it shifted the entire frame. Nora had a second email address. Not hidden in any extraordinary way, it was linked to a tablet she kept in her work bag, a device I had no reason to use and therefore no reason to notice. The investigator didn't access it illegally. He found it because she'd used it to book a hotel reservation under a shared name that appeared in a public-facing event booking system, a small conference venue that kept guest names visible by mistake. The address was a variant of her name, not her work address, not her personal one. The third account, a buffer identity. When he told me, I understood something I hadn't fully grasped before. This hadn't been a moment of weakness. This had been constructed. The third email. The 2 names for Camden. The gym sessions that weren't gym sessions. The calendar location tags she'd forgotten to remove. The one small detail she hadn't managed to clean up. This was a system. A deliberate, maintained parallel life with its own infrastructure. And then B. Holloway called me. B had been Nora's closest friend from university. A warm, slightly chaotic woman who had gradually drifted from their friendship over the past 2 years, in a way that I'd always attributed to geographic distance and differing life stages. She called me on a Sunday morning and the first thing she said was, I've been trying to decide whether to do this for 3 weeks. She told me that she and Nora had a falling out at a dinner party the previous spring. She told me that Nora, after a glass too many, had said something she apparently believed to be between the two of them. A comment about how suffocating she found the marriage, how she'd been actually living for the past 6 months, how she'd met someone who treated her like she was interesting, how it had started at a conference in the spring. She didn't say a name, B said, but she said she'd been happier in the past year than in the past 5. And she looked lit up, Wendell. And I thought I should tell you. I should have told you back then. I'm sorry I didn't. I thanked her. I wrote down every word. I now had photographs, the third email address, a location record at the Meridian, witness testimony from B, the 2-name discrepancy flagged by Delaney, and a metadata trail through the shared calendar. Carla Broom reviewed all of it. She told me it was more than enough. She asked me how I wanted to proceed. I told her I wanted the confrontation to be on my terms. I wanted it documented. I wanted her to have no room to reshape the narrative afterward. She said, then we do this carefully. I chose a Saturday. I chose it because Saturdays had a specific rhythm in our house. Nora typically had a coffee with Delaney in the morning, a ritual they'd kept for years, and returned around noon. I knew she'd be relaxed, slightly off guard. I knew the Saturday version of Nora was not the careful, strategic Nora of weekday evenings. And I had one more thing I hadn't told her about. Troy, my IT friend, the one who'd advised me not to access her devices directly, had helped me set up something entirely legal. A voice recorder app on my own phone. Everything I said in my own home could be documented. Carla Broom had confirmed. In our state, single-party consent applied. I only needed to be present in the conversation. I also had the investigator's report printed and in a folder on the kitchen table. I had the photographs. I had B's testimony in a written and signed statement. I had, at Carla's suggestion, already moved certain financial documents to a secure location and opened a separate account. I had built walls before she knew a siege was coming. When Nora came home that Saturday, she was in a good mood. She came through the door with a canvas bag of groceries she'd picked up on the way home, her hair slightly windblown, cheeks pink from the cool air. She looked And I remember this clearly, with a clarity that still bothers me. She looked like my wife. She looked like the woman I had stood beside 9 years ago and made promises to, the woman I had painted walls with and argued about tile grout with and made a life alongside. She set the groceries on the counter. She noticed the folder on the kitchen table. "What's that?" she asked. "Sit down," I said. My voice was very calm. I hadn't expected that. I had rehearsed this conversation in my head for weeks, and in every version, I was either cold and formal or barely holding together. What came out was neither. It was simply level. The voice of someone who had finished grieving and was now operating on the far side of it. She sat down slowly. She looked at the folder and then at me, and in her eyes, just for a moment, just briefly, I saw something move. Recognition. Fear. The recalibration of a person who has just understood that the conversation is not going the way they expected. I opened the folder. I didn't shout. I didn't accuse. I simply placed the photographs in front of her one at a time. The meridian, her hand on his arm, the hotel confirmation from the third email address, the calendar metadata. I told her about B. I told her about Delaney's call. I told her about the prepaid number, the message that had started all of it. She was silent through the first 3 photographs. Then she made her first error. "You had me followed?" Her voice came out sharp, indignant. The victim register, deployed quickly and without hesitation. "You hired someone to spy on me? Wendell, that is a profound violation of—" "The photographs are legal," I said. "All of it is legal. Carla Broom has reviewed everything." That landed. The name of a lawyer always lands differently than an argument. A silence. "Nora." I kept my voice level. "His name is Camden. You've also called him Curtis. You've been seeing him since at least the spring conference. You have a third email address. You booked a hotel room in April using it." I paused. "I'm not asking you to confirm any of this. I'm telling you what I know. What I want from this conversation is one honest answer." She looked at the table. Her jaw was tight. "How long?" I asked. Another silence. Then, very quietly, she said, 14 months. 14 months. I had not expected a number that large. I absorbed it without expression. 14 months of Friday evenings. 14 months of a calendar with small location tags she'd forgotten to delete. 14 months of a parallel life so carefully constructed that the only thing that had pierced it was a single anonymous message from someone I still didn't know and would never meet. Then Nora made her second error, and it was a worse one. She looked up and said, "I want you to know that nothing about this was easy for me. I tried to find a way back to us. I stayed because I thought we could." "Don't," I said. She stopped. "I have a voice recorder running," I said. "Whatever you say in this room is documented. Carla Broom has advised me that anything you say about the state of the marriage, the nature of the relationship, or your intentions going forward will be relevant to the proceedings." I paused. "So please don't explain yourself to me. Your explanations aren't what this is about anymore." She went white. She tried one more gambit before she left the room. She said quietly that she had been unhappy for a long time, that she had tried to tell me, in ways she clearly hadn't communicated, that something had been missing, that she wasn't trying to hurt me, that she was sorry. I listened to all of it. I didn't respond to any of it. I closed the folder. She called Delaney from the driveway. I heard her voice through the window, a different voice than the one she'd used in the kitchen. Tighter, strategic again. I could hear the shape of a narrative being constructed in real time. The husband who had her surveilled, the invasion of privacy, the cold confrontation. I could hear her transforming from perpetrator to subject. I had expected this. Carla had warned me about it. But there was one more piece. The following week, Camden's name surfaced in an unexpected place. 3 of Nora's co-workers, contacted by the investigator as independent witnesses to visible workplace conduct, gave statements. One of them, a woman named Troy's contact had found through LinkedIn, confirmed that the relationship between Nora and Camden had been common knowledge in the office for nearly a year, that they'd been seen together at a company event acting in a way that left nothing ambiguous, that at least 2 people had wondered whether the husband knew. When that statement arrived, I read it at my desk at work, and for the first time since October, something in me finally, completely broke. Not in anger, not in grief exactly, in the specific, private devastation of understanding how large the circle of knowledge had been, and how small the circle of those who'd told me. B. Holloway had told me. Prepaid number had told me. My own ignored attention had told me. Everyone else had let me walk through a lie as if it were solid ground. The months that followed were not dramatic. They were procedural. Nora retained a lawyer. There were initial communications about the framework of a separation, the house, joint accounts, shared assets accumulated over 9 years. In the first week, she attempted, through her lawyer, to characterize the private investigator's engagement as harassment and the voice recording as a violation of her expectation of privacy. Carla Broom addressed both points in a single letter. Neither claim went further. Then came something I had not anticipated: the false allegations. In December, 6 weeks after the kitchen confrontation, Nora's lawyer sent a letter alleging that I had been emotionally controlling throughout the marriage, that I had isolated her from friends, and that the pattern of surveillance I had engaged in was consistent with coercive behavior. The specific language was careful, legally calibrated, designed not to constitute a formal legal claim, but to exist in the record as a counternarrative. I read the letter in Carla's office and felt a cold, clarifying rage that lasted approximately 90 seconds before it became something else. Not peace exactly. Resolve. "This is the mechanism," Carla said, calm as always. "When the documented evidence is comprehensive enough, this is sometimes the response. She's not trying to win. She's trying to muddy." She put the letter down. "We respond factually and let the evidence speak." We responded factually. Delaney, to her credit, provided a written account of her own concerns. The 2 names for Camden, the dinner conversation, the growing estrangement she'd noticed. B. Holloway's statement was already in the file. The coworker testimony was already in the file. The metadata, the photographs, the hotel records, the email, all of it was already in the file. The allegations did not survive contact with the evidence. There was a moment, in February, when Nora's lawyer proposed a mediated settlement to avoid a contested divorce. Nora would receive her share of the shared assets, a clean split of the equity in the house, and no further claims. I would get the house if I bought out her share. The business of 9 years unraveled into line items. I took the settlement. I didn't want a trial. I didn't want Nora on a witness stand and me across from her with a lawyer asking questions while a courtroom watched. I wanted it done. I wanted to come out the other side of it and start the process of rebuilding a life that was actually mine. The house sold in April. We split the equity. The basil plant, the one on the kitchen windowsill, I threw away the day we signed the final documents. I don't know why. It just seemed like something I needed to do. I moved into an apartment across the city. Mira from my office helped me carry boxes. Troy came and put together the flat-pack furniture and complained about the instructions, and I was so grateful for the noise of it, the ordinary, unguarded noise of people just being people in a room, that I had to go to the bathroom for a minute and collect myself. Simon, Nora's old boss, messaged me once, just to say he was sorry. I believed him and I didn't respond. I heard through Delaney that Camden and Nora were still together. I held that information for a moment, turned it over and put it down. It didn't produce the reaction I'd feared. Not anger, not grief, not the visceral wrongness I'd steeled myself against. Just a kind of recognition. Of course they were. The infrastructure had been too elaborate for something casual. What I thought about, in the quiet of the new apartment, was not Camden. It was not even Nora exactly. It was the version of Nora I had married. The one laughing unguardedly near a window at a birthday party, with red wine and no performance in her. I grieved that version. I let myself grieve it fully, which is a thing I hadn't done during the months of gathering evidence. Months of operating with the cold precision of someone who couldn't afford to feel yet. In June, I had dinner with Troy and his wife. They asked how I was genuinely, and I gave them a genuine answer. I was tired, and I was clearer than I'd been in years, and I didn't know what came next, and for the first time in a long time that felt like a livable condition rather than a frightening one. Not every story ends with a new person or a new revelation or a neat emotional arc. Some stories end with a man in a new apartment on a Saturday morning, coffee going on the counter, No basil plant on the windowsill and the window open, and the ordinary sounds of a street below doing its ordinary things, and the slowly dawning understanding that the life in front of you is entirely your own to build. That, I decided, was enough. That, for now, was everything. What makes Wendell's story so psychologically layered is not the betrayal itself. Infidelity, sadly, is not uncommon. But the architecture of the deception and the way Wendell's own emotional honesty was systematically used against him. Nora didn't simply have an affair. She constructed a parallel existence. A third email address, two names for the same man, a system of cover routines so practiced they had become invisible. This wasn't a person who stumbled into something and didn't know how to stop. This was deliberate design. And the most revealing aspect of it is that the design worked for 14 months. Not because Wendell was careless, but because he trusted completely and therefore saw selectively. This is the psychology of the trusted partner. We don't watch the people we trust. We absorb their explanations without interrogating them. The new passcode, the screen face-down habit, the gym sessions that shifted to evening, each of these individually was a plausible explanation. Together, they were a pattern. But patterns are only visible when you're already suspicious, and suspicion was the one thing Wendell was unwilling to bring into his own marriage. The moment the anonymous message arrived, something shifted. Not into anger, into clarity. And that shift is worth examining, because it tells us something important about how denial operates. Wendell had been absorbing low-level signals for months. The information was available. What was missing wasn't the evidence but the permission to doubt, permission to look, permission to take the feeling that something was wrong seriously enough to investigate. The message gave him that permission. It didn't tell him something new. It gave him the context to see what was already there. His strategic response, retaining a lawyer before confronting Nora, gathering evidence legally, recording the confrontation, is often misread as coldness. But it is better understood as self-protection by a man who had, somewhere in the process of absorbing the facts, understood what kind of person he was actually dealing with. Nora's immediate pivot to victim framing during the confrontation, the indignation at being surveilled, the subsequent allegations of emotional control, confirmed what the evidence already suggested. That her instinct in a crisis was not accountability but narrative management. Wendell's preparation meant she had no narrative left to manage. The involvement of Delaney and B. Holloway complicates the picture morally. Both women knew or strongly suspected and delayed. Delaney eventually acted. B. acted after months of internal deliberation. Their hesitation is understandable. Intervening in a marriage is socially and personally costly, but their delay meant Wendell walked through a lie for longer than he had to. This is one of the story's secondary betrayals. Not malicious, not calculated, but a failure of loyalty rooted in the desire to avoid conflict. The lesson here is quiet but significant. Sometimes the people who care about us protect us least precisely because caring about us makes the cost of intervention feel too high. What the story ultimately reveals is that emotional transparency, Wendell's defining quality, is both a profound strength and a structural vulnerability. He was readable. He trusted completely. He absorbed explanations without suspicion. These are not weaknesses in isolation. They are the foundation of intimacy. But in a relationship with someone who was managing rather than sharing, they became the mechanism of his own blindness. The confrontation, and its controlled aftermath, represent something important: the reclamation of agency. By the time Wendell placed those photographs on the table, he was no longer the person Nora had been managing for 14 months. He was someone who had done the work, felt the grief in private, and arrived at the table fully prepared. In a situation designed to make him feel powerless, he had quietly and methodically become the opposite. Nora's affair and its unraveling can be understood through the lens of accumulated self-deception, not only hers, but the kind that operates across an entire relational system. She had told B. Holloway she'd been actually living for 6 months. This is the language of someone who had constructed an internal justification so complete it had become her truth. The marriage as stagnation, the affair as vitality. The problem with this kind of internal narrative is not that it's entirely false. Something in the marriage had clearly been fading, and both people bear some weight of that, but that it transforms a shared failure into a unilateral verdict. Rather than naming what was missing and attempting repair, Nora had quietly tried and convicted the marriage in private, then acted on the sentence while continuing to participate in the life it condemned. This is the architecture of self-deception. The internal story becomes so coherent, so fully realized, that the external reality, the husband, the house, the 9 years, starts to feel like the fiction. The point of no return in this relationship didn't arrive at the confrontation, or even at the first photograph. It arrived the moment Nora created a third email address. Not the first lie, not the first evening at the Meridian. Those might have been retrievable in some parallel version of events where honesty was chosen. The third email address was the moment the system was formalized. After that, it wasn't a relationship under pressure. It was two separate lives sharing a house. What Wendell ultimately recovered was not just the facts of his situation, but his own perceptive capacity. He had trusted so completely that he had learned to override his own observations. The journey from that Tuesday kitchen, the anonymous message, the dishwasher, the basil plant, to the signed settlement documents is a journey back to himself. Not to happiness, not yet, but to a condition more fundamental, the ability to trust his own reading of the world.